For 97 years, International House has built a rich history of bringing together the world's future leaders to live together, share experiences, and learn from one another. Each year, International House is home to 700 graduate students studying or training at institutions across New York City. Hailing from more than 100 countries, each brings a diverse and unique perspective from their own culture, background, and academic discipline. iHouse programs educate and celebrate the diversity of culture to promote cross-cultural understanding and find common ground that builds lifelong friendships and professional networks. China and its citizens have held a special place in iHouse history, starting with its origins. It was a chance encounter in 1909 with a student from China that inspired iHouse founder Harry Edmonds.
One frosty morning, I was going up the steps of the Columbia Library when I met a Chinese student coming down. I said, "Good morning." As I passed on, I noticed he stopped. I went back. He said, "Thank you for speaking to me. I've been in New York 3 weeks, and you're the first person who has spoken to me."
This interaction opened Edmonds' eyes to the need for a home for international students, where cross-cultural interactions take place daily. Through the philanthropy of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Cleveland H. Dodge family, iHouse opened its doors in 1924. An abiding connection with China has continued for nearly a century. iHouse hosts events with guests from all over the world to address our residents and expand their horizons. Thousands of Chinese graduate students have called International House their home over the years, and China has featured prominently in our cultural and scholarly programming. A tapestry bearing the ancient inscription within the 4 C's, all are brothers, gifted by the daughter of Sun Yat-sen, has hung in International House since 1925. Nearly 80 years later, in 2004, iHouse hosted China Rising, a panel discussion moderated by trustee Fareed Zakaria. A significant number of our residents continue to originate from China. The most prestigious events have historically been staged live in Davis Hall. While the pandemic has impacted our ability to gather in person, we're determined to continue this tradition of promoting peace through understanding between people of all nations. This 2021 series on the future of U.S.-China relations aims to continue a discussion of one of the most important global topics of our time. And now, live from Davis Hall, welcome to International House.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have a very special evening ahead of us. It's special for at least 2 reasons. The first is the simple fact that we are all here together in Davis Hall. We're doing it safely, but we're doing it together. And that, at least to me, is very special. iHouse has always been about bringing people together, very closely together. The pandemic made us face the question of how do you bring people together while at the same time keeping them far apart? And the answer is that it's very difficult. It's not easy. No doubt the experience of today's residents is very different than the experience that our alumni had. But at its core, in a very real sense, it's the same. We are home now to 100 graduate students from 30 countries. With more than a little creativity, this amazing group, several of whom are with us in the hall this evening, is finding ways not just to excel at their studies, but to learn from one another, to experience New York, and to make lifelong friends. And they, like all of us, look forward to the fall when we will again welcome residents to live in the South Building. The second reason this evening is special is the people who are on the stage with me. This stage has hosted many incredible speakers, a few of whom flashed past you in the video we just saw. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Supreme Court justices, 4-star generals, senators, cabinet secretaries, award-winning authors, poets, musicians, and scientists. the UN Secretary General, the chairs of the Federal Reserve, and presidents of the United States and of other nations. And on this very beautiful day in New York, which could have passed for the first day of spring, we are pleased to add tonight's guests to that list. It is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Frank Wisner, who will serve as our moderator and introduce our guests. You will have seen a snippet of his accomplishments in the invitation. I will highlight only one of his positions, and that is as chair of the International House Board of Trustees. We are all very fortunate to have Frank's wisdom to guide our board and to guide this institution. And it is my pleasure to welcome him back to the House this evening. Frank?
Thank you. Thank you, and my own word of welcome to everyone who's able to participate in this, the first in a series of discussions of China and the United States. And so I want to begin in particular with a word of thanks to Brian. Brian, to you and your team for putting this evening together and making it such a special case. All of us admire, Brian, what you've done. The idea of this evening was your inspiration, but you put it together in a most special way to remind all of us that iHouse carries on despite the exigencies of the period of COVID-19. But I particularly want to say thank you tonight to our two very special guests. To my immediate left is Liz Economy, a great scholar of Asia, of China, author with the Council on Foreign Relations and with the Hoover Institute. And to Liz's left, Danny Russell, former Foreign Service officer, senior official in the United States government. The two of them bring to bear tonight expertise on the subject that we're going to explore, and that is the future of U.S. relationships with China and China's relationships with the United States. We started a very special time. About 52 days ago, Joe Biden was took over as President of the United States during the campaign, and after the campaign, he promised that he would pay special attention to the issue of China and our relationship. He recognized that we have a major challenge before us as Americans, a different challenge in nature than the challenge of global climate change, but nonetheless the most important single challenge on the screen of American foreign policy. But having said that, Joe Biden also made it clear that he was not going to pursue a Cold War, nor would he pursue the fruitless objectives of American hegemony in the Asia-Pacific area. And so I come to you tonight with Liz and with Danny, believing that the President and his administration, while they will give great importance to the China relationship, the policy of this administration will not be China-centric. And what one will find is civility, a degree of interest in dialogue, and if the timing couldn't be better than today's events, the curtain's been raised on the future of American policy and diplomacy, with the President's meeting with his Japanese, Australian, and Indian counterparts to begin to set the stage of how we intend to deal with China, and that is within the context of a balance of power in which there is respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the institutions that we all live with. So even if I put it the way I just did, I'm going to argue that China is going to be central to American policy, not exclusive, but central. As the opening rounds of the administration have made clear in the document titled Interim National Security Strategic Guidance, very early, most unusual for administration to come out with a document that defines the direction the administration, president intend to take with China, how we're going to pursue a relationship that will have edges of confrontation when the mark is crossed, of deep competition, and of cooperation where we can find our way forward. But the basic objective, I hope my colleagues tonight will agree, is to find a long-term approach to the relationship with each other, a durable, if competitive, cohabitation with the People's Republic of China. Of course, China has her own ambitions, her own grand national strategy. She has her own view of how to pursue relations with the United States. And tonight, we're going to be able to explore China's perspective as both of us move to try to obtain a strategic framework for managing our relationships. So with those short words of introduction, I'm going to turn, first of all, Liz, to you and ask you if you could give us your assessment of where the relationship between the United States and China stands today.
Well, thank you, Frank, and let me also thank Brian for inviting me to be part of this really special evening. It's a treat to be back live here in Davis Hall to talk about this critical relationship of the United States and China. You know, frankly, you said it all so well. I'm not sure you need me and Danny here to say anything more, but let me just offer a couple of thoughts. I think the relationship is in, one of the most difficult periods, one of the most difficult states that certainly I've seen it in the quarter century or so that I've been working and studying U.S.-China relations. For most of that period, the U.S. and China, the framework that we had was one of engagement, right, where we were trying to draw China into the international system and believed that if China joined international organizations and treaties, the ones that underpin the rules-based order, that over time China would become a stakeholder in that system, and that as China's middle class grew, it would reform politically and economically. I think with the advent of Xi Jinping beginning in 2012, that notion sort of lost currency. Xi Jinping moved China in a fairly radically different direction. And then, of course, we had Donald Trump come in, and the relationship really took on a much more competitive cast. I think we moved from engage but hedge to something more approximating compete, counter, and contain. I think we're now entering a third stage, which I think you correctly characterized from the perspective of the United States, that is going to be competitive. It will be confrontational at times, but there will be an effort to find areas of common ground and common purpose, and I think that is very important. Having said that, I think we are also in a stage where when I look across the landscape, whether we're talking about the political and ideological realm or the security realm or the sort of trade and investment area, there is a lot of conflict. There are very few areas right now where the United States and China have a true coincidence of interest. I think we can talk about them, things like global climate change, for example. I think there are some areas, but I do think that we are largely in a competitive space where what China desires and what the United States desire are fundamentally at odds. I'll just finish by saying, I think if you look right now at what's taking place in the political realm, China actively is promoting a different type of model, one that has a different basis in terms of human rights in areas of internet governance, the relationship between state and society. So I think it's going to be challenging moving forward.
Liz, I want to pursue what you've just said one step further. I find as I listen to the American debate about China, there is a peculiar lack of understanding of what I might call China's grand national strategy. What is it that China aims to, where does China aim to be? What is its strategy? Can you help us understand that? Because I think if you don't understand that, then you don't understand how we're going to be able to shape the relationship.
So here's the good news. Xi Jinping likes to talk, and he's published 3 volumes of his speeches, totaling roughly 2,000 pages. So if you want to understand Xi Jinping's strategy, you just have to crack open those books and start reading. But I would say, in a nutshell, what Xi Jinping when he talks about his Chinese dream, it's really about reclaiming a degree of centrality for China on the global stage. It's about the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. In practical terms, I think if you look through Xi Jinping's eyes, I would say you could sketch that out in sort of 4 concentric circles. To begin with, it's about China, reunifying China. So China's going to reclaim the territories that it claims as sovereign territory, right? So we've seen the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, but also ambitions in the South China Sea and Taiwan, and of course border disputes with many other countries. Beyond that, I think China does want to push the United States out as the preeminent power in the Asia Pacific. We can talk more about that. I think, it wants its own political interests, security, economic, and political to be embedded in other countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its technological dominance. So it wants to, its Belt and Road, basically the digital Silk Road is about, China sort of setting the technological standards for the 21st century. It has that kind of ambition. And then finally, I think China is seeking to reform norms and values in global governance institutions like the United Nations, again, to align more closely with those that China possesses. So I think it's a grand ambition to transform the international system, to make it safe for China and to advance Chinese interests.
Liz, you started your explanation by referring to Xi Jinping and the thousands of pages of explanation. But where does he fit into that, and where does the Communist Party fit into that grand strategy and ambition?
Well, I mean, Xi Jinping fits into it because I think he is part of a tradition, but he is also an architect. And one of the things he has said a couple of times over the past decade or so is that he sees himself as a part of a relay race, right? Where I think he's the 4th runner in the race. But basically, you pass the baton, to the next runner. So you're continuing the race, but you also strike out on your own path forward. And I think that is what he's done. So some of what we see Xi Jinping doing, comes out of a long tradition. And I mean, all the previous leaders have talked about the invigoration of the Chinese nation or the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But he is the one who's given life to that notion, who's, I think, enabled us to understand, what that could look like in ways that certainly Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao never did. I mean, when, Hu Jintao talked about a harmonious society, it was about rectifying the imbalances of, the go-go economic growth of the Deng era. There was always ambition, and many people will date sort of the inflection point to the 2008 global financial crisis, where China came to appreciate, which predated Xi Jinping, of course, where China came to appreciate that the US model was maybe not so perfect after all, if for those who thought that it was to begin with, and that, that moment when China thought, that inevitable period where China was going to surpass the United States, could have been 2050. Maybe it was going to happen a lot sooner than people thought. So I think there's always been that ambition, but Xi Jinping has brought this ambition, he's made it concrete, at least for me, in ways that I had never seen articulated by previous Chinese leaders. And the Communist Party for Xi Jinping is central. Last thing I'll say, because I feel like I'm going on too long, but I think, when he very first came to power, in his first speech, in the fall of 2012, he said that corruption, if not addressed, could be the death of the Chinese Communist Party and even the death of the Chinese state. And he has focused intensely on making the Chinese Communist Party free of corruption. He hasn't really succeeded, but he's brought 3 million members of the Communist Party, right? He's detained them at the very least on charges of corruption. That's out of a 90 million member Communist Party. That's not inconsequential. And he's also sought to intensify the role of the party in Chinese society and in the Chinese economy. So it's a very different model that he's developed than I think certainly most people here anticipated out of the Deng to Jiang to Hu and One eras.
Denny, I'd like to ask you if you could pick up there and think with us for a moment. The president has just met leaders of the Quad. The competition is set up with China. What comes next? What should we be expecting to happen over the next year to two?
Well, first of all, Frank, I'm honored to be here, particularly with you and Liz at iHouse. Thank you very much. And it was interesting to me to listen to Liz. I should begin with a disclaimer that I'm a policy practitioner, not a scholar. I would diagnose, frankly, the state of the U.S.-China relationship as in extreme distress. And I think that it's in tatters. I used to talk about the pendulum swings in the bilateral relationship, and over the last few years I've started wondering if instead of a pendulum it wasn't more like a downward spiral. That's pretty hard to pull out of because there are a predominance of hawkish voices on both sides. The ideas of traditions of moderation, compromise, and engagement have largely been discredited. So I think any starting point for imagining where we may be headed has to kind of recognize the strength of the momentum, the negative momentum, in the relationship where there's a predisposition on both sides to assume the worst and to embark on kind of worst case planning. And what I see is that in the bilateral relationship, cynicism is no better than naivete. It's very hard to set a foundation of objective, calm, rational, constructive thinking when it comes to policies towards the United States in Beijing or policies towards China in Washington. And on top of that, I think we should be honest about the messaging and the attitude that's emanating from Beijing.
Yes.
There was a major political shift in the United States with the transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. But there's been no change in China. And what we see is this narrative of the East rising, the West in decline.
Yes.
And it's not without some foundation. The Communist Party has had some formidable successes, particularly in dealing with COVID-19, and the United States has had some disheartening failures. So that's the stage, I think, on which Joe Biden enters. He has been, like Xi Jinping, extremely clear about what his ambitions are. He's been clear that job number one is trying to put America's house in order. And I would cite some of that to his experience in the Senate dealing with Eastern Bloc Soviet counterparts, Leninists. And in that experience, he learned the absolute importance of demonstrating strength in the relationship with an authoritarian party state. I think that it's clear that as president, he recognizes that unless and until the attributes of strength in the United States are manifest, the job of trying to affect China's behavior, which is really at the heart of what international relations and diplomacy often is going to be even more difficult, if not impossible. Thus, he's focused on getting control over the pandemic, working to rebuild and re-energize the U.S. economy, invest in infrastructure, deal with our extreme social divisions and racial frictions and so on. And very importantly, and he said this again and again, and as you referenced this morning, he demonstrated it very graphically in the Quad meeting with the 4 other leaders, ensure that we are contending with China not in isolation, not alone, not on a one-to-one basis, but in concert with other like-minded countries. So what I think that means, Frank, is that on the US side, there is an interest in the Biden administration with, let's say, buying time to some extent. Or to maybe put it more accurately, there's a recognition that there is very little prospect of successful negotiation and problem solving if the Biden administration were to tackle the issues directly with China at this early stage, both because of the political backdrop and resistance from Congress and elsewhere. Negative sentiment towards China is extremely high in the United States and I think needs to subside. But also because the Chinese feel right now that they are dealing from a position of strength, that the correlation of forces favors them, that the United States is weak. That's just not the right environment in which to begin troubleshooting and problem solving. I'd just add the further interesting irony that if you look at the calendar, it may well be that Xi Jinping himself is looking for a period of relative calm and stability, is not interested in a dust-up or in a full-scale engagement with the United States. They've just completed a pretty consequential National People's Congress, new economic 5-year plan. July marks the 100th anniversary, the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party, which Xi Jinping has begun using as an important political springboard for the big event, which is the 20th Party Congress a year and a half from now, where presumably he will be deified as one of the immortals of the Chinese Communist Party. And before they get there, they've got the Winter Olympics, which we know from the past Olympics is a very important tool for telling China's story and burnishing its standards. So it may be, Frank, that we see a slow period of feeling each other out, of jockeying for position, of competing but not negotiating, or at least not negotiating in a full way.
Denny, pick up that point, though. In very short order, our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and our National Security Advisor, a most uncommon dual approach, will engage the Chinese in Anchorage, Alaska. That's a pretty strong signal that there is a diplomatic engagement to counterbalance the signals and the Quad and the alliance approach. What do you expect to be on the agenda when China's foreign policy, national security leadership, and our foreign policy and national security leadership meet?
Well, I think it's a very smart approach, and it makes perfect sense to me. These are people that I know well and have worked with, and while I'm not speaking for them, I feel intuitively that I understand where they're going. So for the meeting with, the first major meeting directly with the Chinese to take place literally on the heels of Secretary Blinken and Defense Secretary Austin's consultations, first in Tokyo and then in Seoul, with 2 of the closest US allies in the region, is a sequence that makes sense. For the Biden administration to begin not with a grand state visit or not with a pilgrimage to Washington by Yang Jiechi or others, not by the announcement of a resumption of some new variant of an old approach, the strategic and economic dialogue or the strategic economic dialogue, et cetera, but instead in a remote place, apart from the politics of Washington, in almost, shall we say, neutral ground, to have the two principal actors in American foreign policy, both of whom are very close to the president, sit down with the two Chinese principals, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. I think that makes a lot of sense. And what I would expect them to do is not to dive into an effort to untangle the knots, as Yang Jiechi likes to put it, not to look for solutions, but to begin the process of, number one, laying out what the strategic vision of the United States government and the Biden administration is. What are the things that matter to us? What are the things we're trying to do? What are the things that concern us and that we are worried will create risk in the US-China relationship if they persist? Secondly, and this is something that I know that Joe Biden believes in, is to listen. Now, there's an art to listening to Chinese officials. You've got to really get past a lot of boilerplate, a lot of party line. But it's necessary, it can be done. And the good news is that Biden has, in both his national security advisor and his Secretary of State, two battle-hardened veterans of diplomacy, of foreign policy, two people who have a track record with the Chinese and I think have at least the ability to hear. So this is not, I don't believe, a structured dialogue that's going to necessarily continue as is. It's not the starter gun for the resumption of the so-called SNED. I see it as something of a mapping exercise.
It makes so much sense to me, Denny. Thank you. But it strikes me as well that while it is a process and a mapping exercise, there are some very important issues that are before us. There is the resolution of Afghanistan. There's growing possibility of conflict in space. There's so many questions beyond your COVIDs and climate change where we in China need to find common ground. So if you're looking for common ground in your mind, where do you think there are possibilities of the United States and China finding that common ground?
The challenge, Frank, is that right now we are in an extremely tactical phase of the US-China relationship. And the question that American policymakers are asking is twofold. One, what are the Chinese really after when they seek ostensible cooperation on issue X or issue Y? Is this intrinsically about problem solving, or is there an ulterior motive, i.e. to demonstrate to third countries that China and the Biden administration have clearly found some way forward, so you little countries don't think America is going to come riding to your rescue if you cross us? There's a deep well of cynicism that's not without foundation, and frankly, that exists on both sides. Now, we've already seen in some specific areas, including the Middle East, U.S. officials beginning dialogues with Chinese counterparts. And let's remember that as diplomatic positions on the U.S. side get filled, there will be more and more occasions of policy-related interaction at lower levels. But I don't think that, or I would be surprised if the senior people in the Biden administration believe that there is a shortcut to engaging in a constructive and authentic search for strategic common ground on the big issues until there is a better equilibrium in the political relationship between Washington and Beijing.
I like the way you put that, but there is one area that affects immediately Biden's and Blinken's promises to make foreign policy work for the American people, and that's trade. Do you see common ground on the trade front?
Trade, I think, is in a way the most treacherous of the areas for the Biden administration. Were it to try to go beyond its current inheritance in the form of the Phase 1 agreement and a whole host of tariffs. My experience in international relations, and I suspect yours, is that particularly in a country as powerful and as wealthy and as determined as China, leverage is the most precious commodity you can have. And for all of his faults, the former President Donald Trump bequeathed to Joe Biden a treasure trove of leverage in the form of these tariffs. And it is improbable, in my view, that the Biden administration is going to lift them anytime soon, both for political reasons and tactical reasons, but also because you don't just lift sanctions, you negotiate a way forward. And negotiations are hard, and that's not where they're starting. What they also have is the rump Phase 1 trade deal, which by all accounts, including the Peterson Institute, the Chinese side has grossly underperformed on. And won't there be a strong rationale for making this a test case of whether China is a country that lives up to its obligations, fulfills its commitments? Are we getting off on the right foot? That is an approach on trade that seems reasonable. But to go beyond that, as we've seen when the topic of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera, comes up, and try to expand trade relations or alter and build out the trade deals with the Chinese seems awfully ambitious for the initial period.
You know, you made an awfully important point about leverage that this administration has inherited and leverage the Chinese have in trade, given the necessities of keeping the world afloat and the economies reviving after the COVID period. But one does really hope that the pursuit of leverage does not cloud one's vision of where you want to go, that leverage becomes an end in itself. Right. And so I think Mrs. Liu and the new USTR is going to have her hands full translating leverage into outcomes, outcomes that actually benefit the two parties. But Liz, I want to come back to you for a moment. This is going to be, as Danny has pointed out, as you've made clear, a very dangerous period. There are a lot of risks out there, things that could go wrong. And I wonder if you would like to help us think through what those principal risks are and how to manage them.
Sure. Let me just offer one thought on the trade front, though, and that is that I think the Biden administration is going to face a fair amount of pressure from U.S. business. I think, China has made some strategic moves in terms of opening up their capital markets, some sectors like autos, and, they signed a big investment deal with the Europeans. And I think there's going to be pressure emanating from some sectors in the United States to say, we don't want to lose access to this market. We want back in. And, frankly, the tariffs have not, I agree they're leverage, absolutely, but they have not done much good for the U.S. economy, right? So, they've cost the U.S. economy, and they've hurt the U.S. economy more than they've hurt the Chinese economy, and the Biden administration is aware of that as well. So I think there are going to be some countervailing pressures on the trade front. And just let me make one positive note, which is unusual for me because Danny was so negative, he stole my usual space. Let me offer a different point, which is I think there is room for cooperation on climate change. I think we already see the United States and China, they're co-chairing a working group on green finance. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we can find some space there. And I know that, Senator Kerry, former Senator Kerry, who's leading the U.S. Sort of position on climate change, is quite interested in trying to work with China. So I do think there's some avenues, and we can talk some more about that later if people want to. But in any case, in terms of the risks, look, I think risks are everywhere in this relationship right now. On the security front, I would say that the greatest risk certainly is in the space of the South China Sea and Taiwan. And yes. China is now a global military power, so risks will emerge in more areas looking forward, I believe. But for right now, that I think is the critical space. I want to agree with Danny about Xi Jinping thinking that this is a time where he wants to have relative calm in the relationship. But I will say that he has demonstrated a pretty high tolerance for disequilibrium. And I think if we look back over the past year during the pandemic, who would have imagined that you'd have that border conflict, that deadly border conflict with India, right? And over several months, right? And who would have thought he'd impose that national security law on Hong Kong? It seems to me that he took advantage of the distraction of the United States and much of the rest of the world to press forward pretty aggressively with some of his top priorities related to sovereignty. So I worry that, if the United States doesn't get its act together, would he make a move on Taiwan? Maybe not, but, would he, really push the boundaries? I think entirely possible. And look, they launched that cyber attack on the, was it Mumbai, on the electrical grid there. I think he's pretty aggressive in ways that I find concerning. And so I'm not quite as sanguine. So I think Taiwan and the South China Sea one. I think another concern, after having said that I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for improvement in the trade relationship, is this process of decoupling. I think is significant because it's happening both, it's emanating from the China side with, Made in China 2025 and now the dual circulation theory, which has built into it a kind of selective decoupling, and certainly on the US side, where I don't think we've resolved the extent to which we're prepared to, sacrifice clear economic interests for national security. And we don't know how quite yet to ring fence the core technologies. I think that's going to be a big task for the Biden administration moving forward, is figuring out what is truly essential for US national security and what is not. I think the Trump administration went out with, they took a very wide sweep there to the point where you began to think that virtually anything that we did in terms of trade or investment that might help the Chinese economy grow was somehow harmful to US interests. So I think they're going to want to rein that back in. But I do think that decoupling process is problematic.
Very serious.
So that would be a second risk. Politically, I guess what I find, most troubling personally, I don't know whether this is really a risk in the US-China relationship, but I do think that China's coercive tactics and its abuses in the human rights field are just beyond the pale at this point. And so, its willingness to basically abduct foreign nationals, and they're Australians and they're Canadians, there are Americans, and hold them without, due process. There is not the rule of law in China. I think this is, a serious risk. Certainly it's a risk to citizens globally. I think it's also a risk to China's reputation. And I would point out that despite China's, I think you began by talking about, or maybe Danny, the sort of the wind at China's back, it's feeling very confident. The truth is, if you look at polls across much of the world right now, that Xi Jinping, sort of faith and trust in Xi Jinping is incredibly low. I mean, even in places like Cambodia, you're looking at, under 20%. And, I just saw the most recent poll that came out of a research institute in Indonesia looking at Southeast Asian countries. I mean, it's extraordinary the degree to which countries, with the exception, I think, of Laos in the region, do not believe that China upholds international rules, do not want China to be the regional leader. So I think that Xi Jinping's assertiveness, the way that the pandemic, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the way that all of that was managed, has hurt China on the global stage.
Yeah. I think you're right, and you were wise to underscore human rights, not just the detention of foreign nationals, but the treatment of Chinese populations faced with an American administration that gives very, very high priority to the responsibilities we as Americans have to remind the world a better place is in front of us if human rights are respected. So I'm really glad you touched on that, but I'm going to push you back to the opening portion in your remarks when you identified risks and ask you to pause for a moment on Taiwan. I say that in part because there is a very active debate underway, partly from the Council on Foreign Relations, those saying we ought to draw lines, those saying we can't draw lines. What's the right approach to Chinese pressure on Taiwan, and what's the wrong way to go about it?
Right.
Is ambiguity still work? What does it really mean? How do we manage this Taiwan problem?
I have to say, I don't think that at this point, ambiguity versus greater clarity over whether or not the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan is going to have much of an impact on Xi Jinping. I think, in truth, reclaiming sovereignty over Taiwan is an ambition that he wants to realize. I think he and the majority of the sort of foreign policy thinkers in mainland China have come to the conclusion that sort of earlier wishful thinking that economic integration would promote political integration with Taiwan, that they no longer believe that. They see that's not the direction in which Taiwan has been moving. I think they're concerned about Taiwan's sort of its greater presence on the global stage, the extent to which the United States is moving to integrate Taiwan in various ways, partly into the free and open Indo-Pacific. I think Tony Blinken just mentioned that certainly if there is a meeting of democracies, Taiwan will be included in that. So now you've got, a number of European countries becoming active in the South China Sea. I think there's a sense that the U.S. might try to bring Japan and Australia, perhaps even in some European countries, into some kind of concert of something to support Taiwan, to bolster Taiwan. So I think there's a growing concern in China that's going to prompt them to think more aggressively about taking action. So what do we do to prevent that? I think it will rely on bolstering Taiwan's defense, having Taiwan itself take on a greater burden and responsibility for self-defense, getting its citizens motivated and active and thinking about this in a proactive way that they really haven't had to or been willing to, I think, for a while. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think the danger here on the U.S. side is that we potentially elevate form over substance, and that we needlessly provoke, right, without actually doing anything that enables Taiwan to maintain better self-defense. So a Taiwan Travel Act or various moves that were made during the Trump administration, and some bills that Congress has considered, I've had the opportunity to review and frankly warn against. So things that just sort of rhetorically promote Taiwan as independent, but again, don't do anything to actually bolster Taiwan's defense capabilities. I would prefer that we do the latter rather than the former. What is it? Walk softly and carry a big stick.
Yes. And make sure your political contest at home is not translated into actions that you take in Taiwan. Be a terrible mistake. Well, I think we've we really exhausted a number of questions and opened up a great many. But Danny, I can't resist. Do you have a word to add to this Taiwan conundrum?
Yeah, very much so. I think that the United States has an immense interest in sustaining an open, democratic society in Taiwan. We also have a huge interest in ensuring security and stability in the region, maintaining a constructive relationship with China. I could not agree more with Liz that the use of Taiwan as a political cudgel or as a brick to throw through Xi Jinping's window has worsened the security situation and increased risk and pressures, not ameliorated them. But it's also a mistake, as important as military deterrence is, and as great as the anomaly that Switzerland does more to invest in its own national defense than Taiwan does. It's not fundamentally a military problem, and there won't fundamentally be a military solution. I think that there is really a lesson to be learned from the Hong Kong experience with the national security law, namely that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The formula that we're seeking with respect to Taiwan is what combination of actions, behaviors, everything from reaffirming our One China policy to our trade arrangements and military arrangements, what combination of political, economic, military factors, including the quality of our relationship with Beijing, are most likely to lead to a calculus in Beijing that this is not the time to act precipitately. If, conversely, our actions have the effect of convincing Xi Jinping and the leadership that the window is closing, the window of opportunity for unification is slipping away, then their willingness to accept great risk will emerge, and we will be faced with a series of horrible choices.
Well said, Denny. Well, we have had a terrific opener today, so I think we're going to turn now to questions. And the first round of questions will come from iHouse residents who have 2 microphones available, and I hope that you will line up and take advantage of that. And while you're asking your questions, I appeal to the audience who are not present in the room to think about their questions, and using the chat function on your computer, enter in your preferred questions. And then we will do our best to take as many as we can. But the floor is open now to the iHouse residents in situ, and let me start with the young lady on my left. Would you do me a favor when you ask your question, introduce yourself, tell us your name and where you're studying, and then ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much for, again, coming here and give us this wonderful talk tonight. And it's so wonderful to be back in Davis Hall and enjoy this wonderful event. My name is Sunny. I am from China. I recently graduated from Columbia School of Social Work. I now work as a social worker. And I remember when, Liz, you just now laid out the aims that China is aiming for. One of the aims is to reform or offer an alternative like values and norm system for the world. And I think with the Chinese or China dream that President Xi is promoting, they're really trying to offer like an alternative story to countries who are sort of disenchanted by European and American ways of pursuing democracy and human rights and like this way of democracy. I think you also mentioned somewhere in your book about that. I'm just curious to hear more about what are the ways that is leading these countries to become disenchanted by this European American story of democracy and
Got it.
yeah, and also where does the China story fit in? And by your observation, over the past 10 years, has it been working? And how are things going?
Liz, that's a plateful for you.
It is. Okay, I'll try to be relatively succinct. I think there are two different kinds of countries that we're talking about when we're talking about countries that are interested in the China model. I think there are those where the leader is already authoritarian, so to have Chinese assistance in bolstering the sort of strength of the state through internet controls. China does capacity building for countries that are part of the Belt and Road on how to do real-time censorship of the internet, for example, how to control civil society. So there's that element of it that correlates as well with norms and values that China is pursuing in the United Nations. For example, they're pushing something called New IP, which is to grant the state the ability to control access to the internet for every single user, right? So that at any point in time, the state can basically cut access from any point to any user. So there are states that find that very attractive, of course. And I think, so that's one element. And China finds a lot of support for its policies in Xinjiang and Hong Kong from a number of countries in the Middle East and Africa. So that tend to be the bastions of Chinese support. You know, there are other countries, I think, that have looked at the United States, certainly in recent years, and the chaos, certainly the way the U.S. has responded to the pandemic, and thought that maybe this isn't the best way, that look at the China model in terms of its development, that it, you know, the strong state has its advantages. China's story about poverty alleviation can be attractive. So there's a developmental model element to it that I think some states, you know, find that they can relate more easily to that than to the United States, which is already, you know, an advanced economy. China has a message to sell that's different. So I think there are differences in sort of what different kinds of states take away from a China model and learn. Some are attracted to that authoritarian strong state element. Some are probably more attracted to just the ability of the developmental model, lower cost, lower end technologies, you know, and you know, farming techniques and other things that the Chinese bring in related to development. So that, I guess that's, you know, how I would see it. I can't remember the rest of the other parts of your question.
Good.
Was that enough?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
There's follow-on question. Next question.
Over there.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. My name is Irina, and I am a master's student at Columbia SIPA. And my question is regarding the current treatment of the Muslim minority in China, and do you think that this will have an impact on the U.S.-China relations, and what do you think the U.S. or international response should be in this case?
Danny, I'm going to ask you to take that on.
Hi, Irina. The short answer is yes. It has an immense impact on the U.S. relationship with China, the U.S. approach to China, for a couple of reasons. One is the sheer abhorrence that I think many or most people in the United States feel for the mistreatment of ethnic minorities, as we've seen in Tibet, as we see in Xinjiang, certainly contributes to the general souring of attitudes among Americans towards China, and certainly towards a government that would systematically and actively pursue these really, really cruel and outrageous practices. Second, it has a big impact because the business community, as a general matter, simply does not want to and can't afford to be seen as somehow complicit in the situation in Xinjiang, either the use of forced labor or the possibility that products that American companies are contracting or bringing to the market are somehow involved in this human rights debacle. And that is a significant factor both economically and commercially, but also politically. I think, moreover, as Liz made very clear, President Biden and the Biden administration believe that quite apart from America's military power, quite apart from America's soft power, quite apart from our wealth and diplomatic prowess, and so on, a great strength of the United States and a force multiplier has been the perception that the United States is true to its values. Right. Now, history is littered with the exceptions that prove the rule, but fundamentally, and I think this goes partly to the point of why polls show so consistently deep-seated suspicion and resentment towards China, a strong neighbor, whereas for decades, the United States, with all of its power, has by and large been seen, certainly in Asia, as a fundamentally benign power. So the Biden administration believes that we have to live our morals. We have to be an exemplar. The power of our example, as he often says, matters. And for those reasons alone, it's inconceivable that the Biden administration would seek to gloss over the treatment of religious minorities, and the Uyghurs are perhaps the most egregious example thereof. As far as what we can do, well, we know the things that don't work. So the self-righteous, pulpit-pounding denunciations and the vilification and so on will only get you so far. You can pour sanctions on top of sanctions on top of sanctions, but 0 times 1,000 is still 0 if you're sanctioning people that are beyond the practical impact of the US dollar, for example. What really matters and what would matter is if the Muslim world, if the OIC, if the international community and the governments of Muslim majority nations, including the ones right there in East Asia, were to come together and speak out clearly in condemnation in a consistent way. China experience teaches us quite sensitive to its international image and is highly alert and in fact shockingly thin-skinned. And that is a source of leverage. But a US China hawk can denounce the Chinese from the rafters. Congress can pass bill after bill. It would only be if the Muslim world were unified in that condemnation that China would listen.
Good. Thank you, Denny. Got a question over here, sir.
Yeah.
You're next.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. I'm Stefan. I'm also studying international affairs at Columbia, and I'm originally from Germany. So I found you mentioning the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China very interesting. And since the Biden administration has really put this working with allies forward on China, and this agreement was not very welcome by the Biden administration, do you think that sets off kind of a bad path, the relationship, or is that just a glimpse and it might get better from here?
Liz, why don't you take that one? It's a good question.
I think one thing that we've seen early on is that the Biden administration has had a lot of success in working with its Asian allies, right, and the Quad. And I think Europe is going to take more time, in part because it was burned more deeply by the Trump administration. I think Asian allies had greater success working, and that is when the Quad came back to life under the Trump administration. And so I think repairing that relationship, restoring trust, will take a little more time, but also I think the Europeans have a different threat assessment than the Asians do. I think the Americans and Australia, India, and Japan share a stronger sense of threat coming from China than most in Europe. Even though the Europeans are becoming more engaged, I think there are people like the NATO's Secretary General who is quite interested in playing a stronger role in Asia, has identified China as a very significant challenge. There's your own German defense minister who also takes a very tough line on China. There are, members of the EU Parliament who do so. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that, Europe, I should say also, is not united. And so there are many different voices in Europe, and Germany and France in particular pushed the investment agreement. Other countries were not as supportive of it. And we also see now that some of the smaller Central and Eastern European countries are pulling out of the 17+1 framework that China established for the Belt and Road Agreement, Belt and Road Initiative. So there's a lot at play right now in Europe, and it may be that France and Germany are slower to come to the table to work closely with the United States to some extent than maybe the UK and some other countries. So I'm interested to see how it all plays out. It may not be, just the EU as a whole. There may be some fragmentation in some respects. But again, I think it's worth pointing out that both Germany, UK, France, the Netherlands are all sending, ships into the South China Sea in support of freedom of navigation. So I think it'll be a mix around different areas. And sorry, last point, on the issue of Xinjiang and Hong Kong, Europeans and the Americans, even during the Trump administration, stood up together, censured China in the United Nations, and I expect that will continue.
Liz, would you disagree with the following proposition, that it depends also what we ask Europe to do? If we ask Europe to join with us in developing technology alternatives, or we ask Europe to join with us in offering infrastructure opportunities, or we ask European nations to join in the values argument that Danny just addressed, if we ask those questions, we may get different answers. So it isn't just an all or nothing proposition. It depends what you ask for from Europe, depends on what you will get as an answer.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I will point out, and the Trump administration doesn't get much credit, but I will say that they did alert the world to the potential challenge, security challenge of Huawei, and nobody expected the kind of success they got, even in European countries, in terms of bringing those countries around to recognize the threat and in many cases to bar Huawei from their future 5G networks. So you're right. I think there is a question of what it is that we're asking of them, but sometimes also the United States plays a really important role in educating and alerting other countries.
Yes. Fair enough. I think we have time for a question on this side of the house.
Thank you very much. My name is Rich. I'm in the political reporting program at Columbia Journalism School. I'd like to ask you, among the higher echelons of the CCP, what are seen as the gravest threats to China's internal stability and its economic growth? I'm especially interested to know what you think, where the climate crisis might fall on that list. And given the fragmented nature of China's political economy, are there any provincial governments or corners of the bureaucracy that might be especially concerned about the economic fallout of climate disruption?
Liz, I'm going to put that one on you.
Yeah, this is an interesting, sort of complicated question. I think the Chinese government is concerned about climate change. This government has been much more proactive on the environmental front than previous Chinese governments. I think the initial impetus came not from climate change, but from domestic environmental issues, in particular, the air quality. So, the environment was the largest source of social unrest in the late 2000s. So right as Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang came into power, into the top leadership positions, they were confronted with, 50,000 environmental protests. And there was a sense that the environment really had emerged as almost as equal to the economy in terms of legitimacy for the government. So you had calls on the internet, for the government to take much more aggressive environmental action. And it's also, the Chinese government, I think, was aware that, if you looked at other countries like in Eastern Europe, you would see that the environment often was at the forefront of broader pushes for democratic reform. And, in China, also environmental organizations were at the forefront of civil society development. And many of the heads of those environmental organizations came out of the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, right? So there's a whole train of concern there with the environment and the potential for political unrest and a push for political reform. I don't think climate change necessarily is where that all started, but certainly they are attuned to the bigger challenges that climate change, pose for agriculture, in terms of the, melting of the Himalayan glaciers and the flooding and then the droughts. I mean, these are all issues that China has been very familiar with. Sea level rise is a concern on the coastal side. So I think, again, Xi Jinping has, put out the ambition for climate neutrality by 2060. They've said that, this sort of push on green technology is important to them. I think that's true. They are developing a carbon market. What did not come out of this 14th five-year plan was the kind of targets and timetables that China is famous for. Yes. In terms of addressing climate change, though, in terms of real reductions for CO2 emissions that would enable them to reach that 2060 objective. So they deal with energy intensity, carbon intensity, as opposed to absolute carbon caps, and that's a problem. So it's important, but it still ranks second to economic growth, is the way I would put it.
Danny, you want to add?
Yeah, if I could jump in. I think that Liz is making an incredibly important and dramatically undertold point, which is that when it comes to China and climate change, it's not about climate change, it's about social stability. I lived the negotiations with John Kerry over the U.S.-China climate agreement, and I think the crux of the reason that we were able to make headway was that we were cutting along the grain of what the Chinese party state had decided it had to do by way of pollution remediation, et cetera, in order to mitigate the risk that Liz alluded to of popular discontent and social reactions. And so the places to look, as she outlined, are the lack of resilience in coastal areas, the huge water challenges that China faces, particularly in the West, the fact that so much of the groundwater is poisoned, that so few the amount of arable land has been so badly eroded. So that's the lens, I think, through which the Chinese leadership is looking. And the reason it is so important is because there is a conceit or an assumption that the United States and China can cooperate for the good of planet Earth because we love Mother Nature, and the climate change agreement is a great example of an objective good that both countries pursue. It's very logical, it's just not true.
Very good point. Well, I apologize to my friends from iHouse residents. I do want to leave some time for those who've dialed in remotely, and let's try some of those questions. And if I have a little bit extra time at the end, I can come back to you who haven't been able to ask your question. So Brian, tell us what we're getting from the audience abroad.
Sure, the first question, actually the first will be from a resident who's just in the North Building, who's not one of the lucky 15 to join us this evening. And Andrew Stahl's question is, how has increased Chinese engagement with organizations like the United Nations impacted relations? To what extent has the U.S. left a gap in these organizations that China has sought to fill?
Danny, it's a good one for you.
There's an immense gap, and the Chinese, in typically Chinese opportunistic way, have been quite adroit at filling it. It comes in a couple of flavors. Some of it is contesting and winning senior managerial positions within the UN system, but particularly in the specialized agencies. Some of it is strategically going after second and third tier directorships across the spectrum of international organizations. Some of it, frankly, is creating their own international groupings and organizations. And another aspect of it is deploying large delegations that are extremely homogenized. This is important in scientific standard setting groupings and organizations where the US and the West send an eclectic mix of academics, fuzzy-headed professors, and each one with their own ideas and marching to the tune of a different drummer. The phalanx of Chinese specialists will come and take unified positions and will flood the secretariat of some of these organizations with an immense number of proposals, variations on a theme, and so on. So there are some pretty sophisticated techniques and tactics at work. This is not simply blundering into an office and finding there's nobody at the desk, so why don't I sit down? This has begun to create problems that penetrated even, I was going to say, some of the thick skulls that made decisions in Washington. Certainly, the loss of traction in the UN General Assembly had very direct consequences for U.S. interests. The greatest risk by far, I think, is on the technical side when it comes to standard setting. Liz alluded to the Chinese principle of national sovereignty and cyberspace. This is being baked into international arrangements in a way that is utterly inimical to the principles of free speech, of data portability and mobility that are precious to the United States and other Western countries.
Good. Brian.
Okay. Next question is from Ronald Schramm, who asks, both countries have serious domestic problems, for example, China's aging population. Discuss how these internal challenges will shape our relationship.
Liz, this is a good one for you.
I'm not sure. I think, for the United States, we've already talked about how President Biden's focus is going to be on the domestic side, renewing America. And so I think, certainly our domestic issues are going to take precedence. I think in China, oftentimes they talk about how we want a peaceful international situation so we can focus on our domestic side. I think certainly, if you look at the 14th five-year plan, it is a lot about the domestic issues. But I also think that there is a certain degree of confidence now that China can address these problems. Yes, it has an aging problem. It has, pensions that are unfunded. It needs to improve the hukou system. It has real estate prices that are, soaring in major cities. It has still huge educational needs in rural sectors. It has 600 million people who live on $140 a month or less. So, there's a litany of domestic challenges that the country faces. But I don't sense the same degree of, we can't be adventurous on the global stage because we have these domestic challenges. I think that China is very comfortable now pursuing its global ambitions and dealing with its domestic challenges. So I don't see the relationship between the United States and China at this point as being defined by the domestic issues. I think there are some areas, as I mentioned, opening capital markets, a few things like that, where they still want the U.S. to come in, and so some of what they're doing on the home front actually is directed toward the U.S. and other countries. But by and large, I see them thinking that we're going to pursue our global, mandate, notwithstanding what we have to deal with on the domestic front.
You know, sometimes I look at the challenges each of us have, but those challenges, the flip side is the opportunity. China's taken problems and turned those problems into opportunities to develop and drive the society. I'd like to think that today we're going to begin to do some serious investment in infrastructure, in development of AI technology and robotics, in biotech, that we're going to be prepared to look out at the world's infrastructure needs, and in rising to the occasion of the challenges, come out with a better U.S. And I don't think that's entirely pie in the sky. I believe it's possible.
No, I think it's possible.
Brian.
The next question is a rather practical one of interest to many here. From Adam Rogers. Do you think the U.S. will allow new Chinese students to receive an I-20 visa and enter the U.S. for college? Will there be an exception to the travel ban?
Wow. Danny, are you up on that one?
Well, I'm not speaking for the administration, and I don't have the authoritative answer, but in terms of the general thinking of the administration, there's clearly a recognition that America's ability to attract the greatest minds from all corners of planet Earth is the secret sauce that has made America great. And what we should be concerned about is not Chinese students coming to the United States. What we should be concerned about is them going home after they've gotten their PhDs. We want to keep them. So I think that the administration is going to look for sensible, manageable ways to screen foreign students and foreign researchers in the interest of protecting crown jewel, sort of sacred technologies and so on, to be on the lookout for obvious malefactors, but to do it in what Bob Gates used to call the small yard, high fence. In other words, with a scalpel, not a chainsaw. None of these broad brush fatwas, which, by the way, don't work. If the Ministry of State Security wants to infiltrate Columbia or iHouse with an intelligence operative, it's not going to be obvious from their I-20 form.
And it isn't the college admissions office that will deal with it.
True.
Great. Brian.
Next question is from Alan Delotavo. In a foreign bilateral relationship, there is always a clash of worldviews and ideology, with each other insisting on its perspective as the basis for the relationship. So how can the U.S. and China find a synthesizing common point and move on to focus on the universal good?
I'm going to go back to Danny because that was at the heart of the opportunities in the relationship. Do you want to try to expand on your earlier remarks?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think that by framing it in terms of sort of setting aside our worldviews and championing the cause of planet Earth is going to reveal a practical way forward.
Yes.
That said, it is important to begin with the Venn diagram of where our interests actually do coincide and overlap. Now, in many cases, and I think Liz alluded to this, the distribution isn't going to be neatly between competition and cooperation. There are likely to be areas where we will agree to coordinate what we are doing so as not to create major problems for the other, but that we aren't willing to actually link hands. This morning, President Biden and the other three leaders announced a pretty interesting Quad initiative to manufacture as many as 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine, and through a combination of what the Japanese are going to do in cold chain storage and what the Australians are doing in last mile delivery, et cetera, are going to make this vaccine available to countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, but more broadly in the region. The United States isn't containing China. It's not trying to stop Sinovacs. The United States isn't in a cutthroat competition with China over which vaccine is going in arms in the region. But the United States is creating an alternative, a viable alternative, and really going perhaps one up on China by not just providing a vaccine, but also supporting the public health infrastructure that allows for the delivery. So there are going to be areas that don't quite fit into the category of cooperation, but that are features of a multipolar and a competitive world. Remember, competition can be healthy. You know, it's kind of what the Olympics are all about, and it's the sort of thing that brings out the best in everybody. You were alluding to that earlier. That's not to be confused with what, you know, criminal gangs do when they fight. That's rivalry that brings out the worst in both sides. When we talk about the areas of common interest, you know, some of them are going to be broad and profound. I mean, neither the President of the United States nor the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party wants war between the two countries. Both of them recognize that transnational challenges like global pandemics, like nuclear proliferation, like transnational crime, et cetera, and like climate change, represent threats that can't be addressed unilaterally, and that the behavior of the other is going to have a consequence. But it's not an easy path to get from there to actual linking up and collaboration on problem solving. That is certainly where we need to aim, and I hope we can restore some degree of practical cooperation. But it is going to be, I predict, an uphill battle unless we content ourselves with the appearance of cooperation, these kind of phony boutique U.S.-China projects that generate a trophy to put up on the mantelpiece, but don't really get at the heart of problems. And at the essence, Frank, is very fundamental, very profound strategic mistrust, and a conviction on both sides that our system is the right one, is better. These are countries of extraordinary exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, I would argue, though, is we're the best, and so you should be like us. Chinese exceptionalism is we're the best, and nobody can be like us.
Denny, I'm tempted to follow on that question with one of my own and let you or Liz take it on. A huge amount has been written about Chinese lending, often called predatory, often called debt traps. It seems to me today, with the challenge of global economic recovery before all of us, that we, the West, China, Asia, are all going to be better off if there is some sense of a coordinated response to manage debt relief to heavily indebted nations, particularly in Africa, Latin America, to get the global economy moving again to our respective advantages. What do you believe are the chances of effective cooperation bilateral or through institutions like the fund? How do you see the prospects of constructive, mutually beneficial action in this field?
Well, I know Danny's actually worked on this issue, so I mean, I'll just say I think we are moving toward that right now. I think China confronts a number of countries because of its Belt and Road lending, which I don't really think was predatory, but certainly was debt-driven. So I think there was a lot of call on China to align its lending practices and its debt relief practices with those of other lenders in the international system. And I think China will get there eventually, if it's not fully there yet. But I know Danny's worked a lot on this issue, so you probably have some thoughts.
And as you answer that, there's Chinese state lending, and then there are Chinese banks and non-bank financial institutions.
Well, on the national level, the Chinese have been swept along with both the Paris Club and G20 types of debt. It's not exactly debt forgiveness, but debt repayment or debt service moratoria arrangements. So I think that the area where we could expect some convergence and correlation in a positive way in terms of helping to remedy the immense debt burden on the least developed countries that's being exacerbated by the after effects of COVID is in the multilateral space. I'm not expecting to see a deal struck between Washington and Beijing on developing nation debt, but there is unmistakably an interest that both Washington and Beijing have and recognize in trying to mitigate some of the crises that are being stoked by the debt. I think more broadly, when it comes to Belt and Road and infrastructure initiatives and both the existing debt and future debt from these Belt and Road projects and so on, there's an interesting irony, which is that the Chinese desperately want and frankly need international capital in support of their projects. The Chinese middle class has done what middle classes throughout history have always done, which is reach the point where they say, why are you pouring our hard-won tax dollars down a foreign rat hole? You should be building a school and a playground for my kids in my village. And the impact of the global recession now on China and Chinese finances has worn the glow off of Belt and Road financing, which in one way or another, Frank, all came out of the Treasury. It was either direct funding or guaranteed.
Exactly right.
If you could get the Belt and Road stamp, you had a high degree of confidence that the China Development Bank was going to bail you out.
Your coffers would be replenished.
But I'm sorry, the irony I'm pointing to is that not only does China have a desperate need for commercial finance, and private money and international banking money will not go into projects that are poorly designed, have not been de-risked, are corrupt or opaque. But the United States and the West has an immense interest in Chinese-funded projects upping their game and being environmentally, socially, politically responsible. Because the failure to do that is causing grave problems throughout the world, and the United States has to bear some of that cost. So there's a beautiful deal to be had, because if for China to get the foreign commercial money it needs, it's going to have to up its standards. But we haven't been able to pick that lock yet.
Good argument. Brian, have you got another
Yep.
question?
And I think, given the hour, this will be the last question. From Frank Wong. China thinks the U.S. is using human rights and democracy as a pretext to make regime change or color revolution. Is that a valid argument?
If you're a Leninist, it is.
Liz, why don't you start with that?
I mean, certainly for much of the history of U.S.-China relationship, the United States has sought to, encourage peaceful transition in China. But is it using human rights, for example, what's going on in Xinjiang right now, or what's taking place in Hong Kong or Inner Mongolia with the language, the issues, or Tibet, to promote peaceful transition or not so peaceful transition? No. I don't think it sees any of these issues as contributing to regime change in China. I think these are pure and simple affronts to, what are global norms, embodied in United Nations covenants. And I mean, the fact that, it's legitimate to call what's taking place in Xinjiang genocide, I think should remove any thought that this is about regime change. This is about atrocities being committed in Xinjiang. And it's not about just the United States. Many countries have stood up to condemn what's taking place in China and Chinese human rights practices right now. So I think, when we put these things in a bilateral context, we're really missing the essence of the challenge. This isn't about the U.S. and containment or regime change. This is about fundamental abuses of very basic human rights.
Danny, I'm going to give you a shot at that as well. I believe, as I look at the Biden administration, as strongly as it feels about human rights, about democracy, there is a very realistic streak that says if you don't respect the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of the other nations in the international system, we're headed into a world of chaos. And that balancing that with the imperatives of values is very clearly recognized. If you accept my argument, then the idea that we would weaponize to defeat China internally, divide her, just strikes me as very far of the mark. And I think that's the point you were making, Liz. But Denny, if you disagree with me or improve on it, go ahead.
I think that the former Secretary of State did a grave disservice to this cause by talking up the idea of turning the Chinese people against Xi Jinping and embracing this kind of neocon notion that China's just an inch away from democracy if only the tyrant could be dislodged. And that lent credence to what is a long-held alibi in the Chinese system and among, as I was joking, most Leninist systems, that everything that the imperialists do can be distilled to nefarious hostile policy aimed at ousting the government. And it hurt. But I think the bigger point is that it's critical for a country like the United States, if we are going to exercise global leadership, to be credible in the eyes, not in our own eyes, but in the eyes of other countries.
Right.
When it comes to our commitment to what Liz correctly points out, our universal values, universal rights. They're not American values. And only, it's a form of deterrence. People have to believe that you really believe it, and that you mean it, and that you live it. And what is undermining our American moral authority is not the fact that we have immense social, racial, other injustices in our country. It is that we went through a period where we were in denial. And I'm firmly convinced that demonstrating how the United States as a democracy works to form a more perfect union and a healthier society has the potential to restore our moral leadership.
Denny, thank you for that. Thank you for being part of this evening. Liz, thank you so much. Would not have been possible. This has been a very, very good discussion. The two of you have brought so much knowledge and such a broad perspective to it. And Brian, thank you again for having the idea of taking on a subject as tough as China, U.S.-China relations, and bringing it to iHouse and bringing iHouse around it, and reminding all of us of the long-standing tradition this House has in building that relationship. That's where we want to get to, and institutions like this that you've so ably led these past months are key to it. So my thanks to you, thanks to everyone here in the hall, Davis Hall, and those abroad who have been listening in and sending in very, very good questions. Thank you.
I will add my thanks to Frank, Liz, and Danny, and to you all. And I will add my thanks to those who were watching remotely. We had over 320 people join us this evening. Many of those were joining us from China, and I thank them for spending their morning with us. And my one final thank you is to note that this program, like all of the other work we do at International House, is made possible by many of the people the generosity of many of the people who are watching us remotely, and we are very grateful for that. With that, I say good night to everyone, and please be safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.